Now, where Premier Li Qiang says United States tariffs have dealt a severe blow to the global economy. The world's second largest economy has nonetheless posted a record $1 trillion trade surplus, raising concerns in Europe and prompting French President Emmanuel Macron to threaten tariffs of his own on his visit to Beijing. Meanwhile, in Washington, Donald Trump is awaiting a Supreme Court ruling on the legality of the tariffs he's imposed since taking office. Monty Francis has the details on the growing tensions and what they could mean for global trade.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day.
When Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on most U.S. imports in April, he called it Liberation Day. But so far, few in the U.S. or the rest of the world appear to be cheering. On Tuesday, China's premier said the tariffs had been bad for the global economy, despite the fact Beijing's trade surplus has just surged past $1 trillion.
Starting from the beginning of this year, we've seen the stick of tariffs being wielded around the world with growing restrictive measures on the economy and trade, which have dealt a severe blow to the global economy.
Trump's tariffs have caused China to redirect goods from the U.S. to Europe, and French President Emmanuel Macron, who just returned from a visit to China, has threatened to impose tariffs of his own on Chinese imports in the coming months if Beijing fails to reduce its massive trade surplus with the European Union. Meanwhile, Trump appears nervous about what the U.S. Supreme Court could decide about the legality of his tariffs, given the Constitution gives the power to impose taxes to Congress, not the executive branch. On Tuesday, he said in a social media post, the biggest threat in history to the U.S. national security would be a negative decision on tariffs by the U.S. Supreme Court. We would be financially defenseless. On Monday, Trump seemed to tacitly acknowledge the tariffs were not having their intended effect, announcing a $12 billion bailout for American farmers, calling it a bridge payment until China resumed buying U.S. farming goods, something he extracted from President Xi during their meeting in October. Critics of the president say he's just solving a problem he himself caused, given China boycotted U.S. agricultural goods in response to the tariffs.
For more insights, let's turn to Jean-François Di Meglio, Economist and Honorary Chair at the Asia Center. Jean-François, thanks so much for joining us here on the show. In terms of the American farmers, if we can just start there, would you go as far as to say, like those critics, that Trump has, in fact, just solved the problem that he himself created, especially when you look at how the U.S. Is going head-to-head with China?
Well, the main impact is obviously China redirecting its exports, as was said, from the US to other parts of the world. If you look at the latest numbers, when you mentioned the $1 trillion surplus, that's over the last 12 months, and actually exports to US fell 25% roughly, while exports to Africa went up 27%. To Europe, it was about 15%. So obviously there is a redirection of Chinese exports. And the main region which benefits from this redirection is probably Southeast Asia, which becomes now the first trade partner for China. So obviously China is hedging its bets, yet China is heavily relying on trade and heavily relying on exports to reap benefits from exports, because otherwise China's growth is impacted by the various trade tariffs.
You mentioned the exports and its heavy reliance on them. In fact, that has also been criticized, with many pointing to the fact that China is overly reliant on exports. And now you say that it is going to increase by 15% here in Europe. What will that mean for the average European consumer?
Well, European consumers may be impacted by tariffs, as President Macron hinted. Yet the first point is that tariffs are not decided at the national level, but they are decided at European level. And if indeed tariffs are decided, that could mean that Chinese price would go down for two reasons. One would be the value of the Chinese currency. Currently, the Chinese currency is very weak because first, it's indexed to the US dollar, which is very weak versus euro. And Chinese currency is also weak with the euro, of course. That brings prices down. And on top of this, you may have price cuts by Chinese exporters if they want to remain. They keep their market share to Europe, especially for cars. Chinese cars have been impacted by tariffs, as you know, some brands up to 37%, yet Chinese cars are still selling into Europe because they are still cheaper than European electric cars.
Who do you see blinking first in this growing trade war? Just leaving the Europeans aside, is it going to be the United States reducing tariffs on Beijing, or is it going to be Beijing diversifying away from its export-driven model?
Well, I wouldn't say who will blink first. The two counterparts, China and the US, know that over time they would decrease their mutual reliance. It's obvious that China is going towards strategic autonomy, exactly like Europe, just like France, but it will take time. So whenever you see negotiation between US and China, that means each side is buying time and trying to become more autonomous vis-à-vis the other one. For example, for chips, China is now building its domestic industry, which is becoming really competitive to the US. Now for Europe, it's a very different game because Europe will have very, very hard time to become totally autonomous on various sectors, be it agriculture, be it chips, be it other sectors, energy in particular. So it will take time. We are also moving towards autonomy, but it will take probably much longer time than for the US or China.
Just a final word on those chips. The United States hardliners have criticized Donald Trump's administration for allowing the sale of thousands of Nvidia chips to be shipped to Beijing.
Yes.
They say that it could lead to China harnessing that technology for military purposes. I'm just curious where you stand on that.
Well, there's probably no mystery about that, but it's not the first time. And this is probably part of a wider bargain. I don't think China is only relying on Nvidia for its military equipments. China also has its own military equipments which are domestic. And as you can see, every month, Nvidia is changing tack from releasing some chips or keeping them from being exported. So yes, the US criticism is right. However, it's only a matter of time before China becomes totally autonomous in that sector.
Jean-François Di Meglio, thanks so much for just unpacking the situation as it stands. Real thorough economic outlook on what's happening in the world of trade.